Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.
Apoio Instituto Brasileiro de Ciências e Inovações.
Hello everybody and welcome to the international edition of Future Hacker. I am Maria Taide and today we are talking to Roger Spitz, founder of Texistential, a research and education platform on innovation and disruption, and the chairman of Disruptive Futures Institute. He also acts as advisor to startups and VCs, board member, and contributes to MIT Technology Review. Hi Roger, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you doing?
Hey Marie, I'm great and so happy to be with Future Hacker today.
We are super excited to have you here. So, let's begin by talking about your career. You actually started as an investment banker, C-level advisor, worked in mergers and acquisitions. So somehow you've always been involved in analyzing the future when it comes to evaluating companies, right? So could you please tell us about your journey? And in particular, please also share with us the connection you told me that you have with Brazil.
Absolutely, Maria. And this is really a fun part for me because it's the journey which led me to so many things which we can talk about and to your wonderful country. But as you say, I started with, in investment banking, focusing on mergers and acquisitions. And that's, to your point, very much looking to the future, very much strategic. And it's a very privileged to be able to have such a focus and advise so many companies and their shareholders and C-level executives on strategic transactions. Well, what I found is that over the years, when you think of the accelerating speed and scale of change and the disruption, where so many industries can basically fundamentally be reshaped overnight and startups can, build entirely new platforms and come out seemingly out of nowhere, even the largest players were displaced. And so I felt that the lens, which was transactional and through M&A, was a bit too narrow, both in terms of the time frame, because often it's looking at the next few years, but also in terms of it not being 360, not looking holistically around the broader meaning of disruption and innovation. And that led me to a journey where I spent time understanding better complexity and systems thinking, and also exponential technologies and artificial intelligence. And I found that foresight and futures is what really allowed me to connect the dots and to have an umbrella where I could think about much more broadly transformational change. And I decided to professionalize that initially with the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, and then academically as well with the University of Houston, which is one of the leading courses and professors around foresight. That's the little journey in terms of my professional focus and where I'm at today. In terms of Brazil, you're right. I have very strong links with Brazil, and it's a country which I absolutely adore. I wish now I was on the beach of Rio and having my bowl of acai. But there's a personal and a professional link to Brazil. On the personal side, my wife Emilia is actually a carioca. My parents-in-law are in lockdown in Rio now, and my brother-in-law as well, João. And visit very frequently over the past 20 years, probably visited Brazil 25 times. And we have a lot of friends in the US and globally who are Brazilians. And professionally, historically, I've worked a lot with the Brazilian companies and transactions in my investment banking days. But even more recently, I work a lot with Spitz and a lot of their events. And so day to day, I probably have calls or meetings through Zoom with Brazil every week or two.
Great to know that you have so deep connections in Brazil. You have family here. That's awesome. And, hopefully you're going to be able to come back here soon. We all hope, right? I'd like to begin by talking about technology innovation and how to balance it with ethical discussions and market regulation. So companies in the US are holding back on some developments like facial recognition, for example, while countries such as China that have fewer regulations or safeguards are investing heavily in those technologies. You mentioned a cyber cold war. So how to deal, on one hand, with the speed of innovation, and on the other hand, the slownesses of the systems? As you say, we're not good at processing exponential, right?
Yeah, so this is a pretty important question because it touches the heart of privacy, ethics, and such fundamental topics for society as a whole and for every single individual. So we need to be very thoughtful in terms of what it means for privacy and ethics. And I think a lot of this has to do with the choices we'll have ahead of us. And people like Yuval Harari, whom I adore, warns us a lot and writes very well about the risks around the fact that human beings have now become hackable and the fusion with technology and biology. When I look at the developments you're mentioning and the choices society can make, I think it's important to err on the side of caution and protection for privacy and ethics. But within that, I do think about two aspects nonetheless. The first one is whether actually we are as thoughtful in terms of privacy and ethics as some would lead us to believe. And what I mean by that is when you look at today, the Western world and the response to the pandemic, just simply in terms of tracing, testing, how organized the quarantine is, in a way, it's pretty chaos and random, right? I feel that there's no concerted decision-making and clarity in terms of the tracing. The technology is there to do that. You see, China is very well organized in terms of tracing. And some might argue, and I'm not saying that I feel that we're doing the wrong thing, but some people think it's just a question of, China is going the way which is very, without safeguards and they're doing what they want. And fortunately, we're being very thoughtful in the West. For tracing, for instance, I'm not sure it's the case. I think the West does have an issue still with privacy and ethics, and I think that is not well protected. And at the same time, I wonder whether sometimes you end up having the worst of both worlds. In other words, we're not using technology in the right way for the tracing, for managing better the pandemic. And at the same time, you're using the excuse of privacy and ethics, which is essential, but effectively, we're not protecting that privacy, and we're not either getting the benefits of the technology, and therefore it's all over the place. So that's the first level at the individual level. And then the second point I would make just briefly is geopolitically, which is, of course, Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, it's very important and it's great that they're rethinking and pausing on, AI facial recognition, for instance. And there's a very strong debate around that, and they're right to be cautious until they understand how that will be used. The only thing I would point out is that when you look at the population of 1.5 billion people and the fact that there are no restrictions in China, the fact that Chinese R&D is pretty much similar to the US at, not far from $600 billion, and that China will be racing ahead, what does it mean on the global scale when you have one country which is just so ahead in terms of AI? And how does the world manage that? And just anecdotally, I would mention that the UK and the US actually signed an alliance to combine AI research precisely because of this issue, which is how do we manage the geopolitical relative competitiveness in terms of AI, especially in relation to China.
Oh, that's really interesting to know regarding the UK and the US. And, definitely it seems that there's no easy answer, right? Just to repeat something that you said that struck me. So we are basically not using technology in the right way. And on the same time, we're still not protecting their privacy while other countries are able to afford to that. So that's definitely a debate that is needed, and it's needed fast. Definitely it's not easy to solve. Moving forward, with the trade and technological war between the US and China, how do you see countries like Brazil turning this into an opportunity to supply products and services to the US? So, while we may not ourselves be the best example of innovators compared to other countries, you mentioned that you see a lot of potential in Brazil due to our creativity, our ability to improvise, which I hope it's in a good way, and to deal with the unknown. With the right investments, could we take this opportunity to fill this gap, and how?
You're right, Maria. I think there is an opportunity for Brazil to play an even more important role on the world scene, and including with technology, with innovation. I personally find that Brazil is already very good at being quote unquote neutral partner, whether it's for China, for US, for Europe. And that's not new. We've seen it in many different areas. With certain constraints in Europe, such as GDPR, with increasing national sensitivities globally, and given the size and the strength of Brazil in a number of segments, I think it is a good time for Brazil to try and play that neutral, trusted partner, in a way the Switzerland for technology. So if you focus on areas where Brazil is already very strong, not least fintech and agtech and digital media and some others, this, for me, is a unique area for Brazil to play that neutrality. I guess the one point I would mention as a sort of closing, and that's following some of the debates around Embraer and the US, is to make sure that when Brazil is able to achieve the leadership in certain segments and have these great companies and play that Switzerland for technology, that it still keeps its own personality and nationality of these technologies and doesn't just sell out to the highest bidder or to the US.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point that you raised. I do agree with you that we're so strong in some fields, like I mentioned, the fintech and the agrotech. But on the same time, unfortunately, we still need to develop, on my view, the most important thing, which is the education part and investing in education, in science, and in technology. So as much as we are trying, and we globally, I would say, trying to hold some founders and developers accountable for the consequences of their innovation on our lives, as we could clearly see in the social dilemma, it just seems to me that having access to quality information about innovation is still a luxury for few. And that's actually one of the reasons why we created Future Hacker, right? Providing information and education, educating people on what's coming to allow this healthy debate to occur, which is essential to understanding what the boundaries should be and where we should be creating incentives so the companies would follow an acceptable path for the benefit of society as a whole. Shouldn't we make it an obligation for high schools to add to their curriculum basic education around digital, the use of data, and social media? Really the basic knowledge so that the young generation understands what's behind this new exposed life that they have. What are the implications? What are the consequences of that? Just for the sake of safety, mental health, and also maybe as a seed for future innovators to solve the current issues we currently face.
I agree. There's a lot to unpack in what you've said, but these are so important points. And one of the ways I look at it when you're talking about education is to think about what the focus of the educational system is. And it's not just a concern for Brazil. I think institutions for education worldwide are doing one thing more than the other, which is looking to the past versus looking to the future. When you look, for instance, at the languages that are taught at school, and I'm, myself, I don't speak Brazilian as much as I would, but I appreciate my understanding of Portuguese to a degree, and the fact that I speak French and the value of learning, languages or the roots of Latin and Greek. But I do also wonder whether data itself should be treated as a language and should be taught at school as a language. You need to decode what free means, quote unquote, free being, to use the terms in Social Dilemma you referred to, if it's free, you are the product, right? And teaching data literacy, which is, you have data that brings information, it brings knowledge and insights, and those insights are monetized. And you have the privacy and the surveillance and the ethics issues we debated. And then we have the fact that you can hack a body because your bodies are becoming biodigital and you can replicate data. And you can also have all the bias, a lack of interpretability of what's the correlation versus the causation, the integrity of the data itself. All of these features around data literacy and what does free mean are essential because human capital needs to develop beyond programming and the data itself. But human capital needs to understand that data is really treated as a language for the digital and dematerialized world of intelligent systems. So the future might appear free, but unless you're fluent in the language of data to allow one to put a cost to it and also a benefit and a return on that language, then I think there's a problem with that. And to your point, it really starts at school, right, with education.
Exactly. And I completely agree with you. Schools are currently looking to the past instead of looking to the future. That's a perfect way to put it. Continue about this subject. It makes our system, our education system, so archaic. Besides not being able to look at the future, is basically we are taught to just resolve questions which there are specific answers that are already known. You talk a lot about your experience in Israel, which is a huge pull for innovation. It has an education system that is focused on problem solving, critical thinking, curiosity, collaboration, and comfort with ambiguity. And those are all skills needed by future leaders. So what does it take us to upgrade our educational system to that? And do you think that both Brazil and the US have been neglecting the democratization of education?
This is an area for me which is really the root of some of my greatest concerns. You know, as we've been discussing in the past few moments together, it really does start in the playground. It starts with education, right? Of course, Israel is an extremely creative country, and you're right. I try and observe how they function and what that derives and brings, and that's an interesting topic. But you also have countries like Finland or others where you can see, even without it necessarily being the same connotation in terms of breakthrough technology as Israel, where they're able to have very advanced, very differentiated educational system, which is more adapted. I worry sometimes, in particular for the US. I think that, not that I'm more worried about the US than the rest of the world, but just to answer your question, first talk about the US, I wonder whether education is a little bit like the healthcare system in the US, which is there are too many organizations and companies which actually benefit from the system remaining as it is. In other words, the problem is that they benefit from this. They benefit because poor education means that they can get extra tuition and private universities and private organizations. And they have their accreditation system, which is very onerous and very antiquated, but which keeps a lot of people busy and brings them revenue. I see four elements to really change. I think the first one is the awareness of there being a problem. I personally think that the US is aware that there's a problem, but they're not necessarily willing to change it. Brazil, I don't know. I think it may not be as simple. I think there might be a lack of awareness to a degree by some of the decision makers. So the point number one is the awareness. The second point, which is the willingness to change. And then you need the third point, which is the agency and the perceived ability to actually drive change. And then the fourth one, which is often very difficult to achieve, is the alignment of all the stakeholders, of all the decision makers who can actually make that change happen. But in the end, it's who's interested in keeping the system as it is or in shifting the system, right? I think in time we're starting to see, and we'll see the democratization and Darwinism, which will bring the right educational models. As people build their portfolios of careers, of skills needed, they'll see what works for them because it is democratized. You can have today with a smartphone in Bangladesh or in a remote part of Brazil or anywhere in the world, pretty much as much information with 5G as a Harvard professor. And companies like Google and many others are building their own reference and educational systems, which they're offering at much more competitive prices. The problem is, how long does it take for the world to be aware of what's required, the willingness to use and adopt a different model and to make those changes? Whether it's the youngsters who are going through the education, the parents who are, and others who are supporting them in those decisions, and then ultimately the demand side, which is the companies and organizations which are willing to employ a certain type of skill. This is a topic which is very much researched by the World Economic Forum and many others in terms of the gaps of skill set and the problem with education. But it seems to be that there are a lot of wonderful reports being issued every week or two, but limited action. And that is, I think, a very big problem for humanity as a whole.
That's such an important topic, and you brought us so many important information that we could actually be discussing that we could have a whole podcast about that, and it would be endless. But unfortunately, we have to end this episode. So for our listeners, stay tuned. We're going to continue this conversation in the next episode. So be right back. Thank you. Thanks, Roger.
My pleasure. It was great. Thanks, Maria, for having me.
Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.
Apoio Instituto Brasileiro de Ciências e Inovações.